A debt paid in vows. Nathaniel Cole had spent the better part of his 30 years avoiding attachment of any kind. Orphaned young, raised on the harsh edges of ranch work, he had built a life around solitude, believing it safer to need no one than to risk losing them. So when the town council summoned him to settle a debt his late father owed the former sheriff, Nathaniel expected land, cattle, perhaps years of unpaid labor. He never expected marriage. The debt, it turned out, could only be settled one way, by marrying Abigail Reyes, the young widow of Sheriff Thomas Reyes, a woman left with a modest homestead, to small children, and no way to manage the land alone after her husband's death in a shootout the previous winter. The town elders, eager to see the debt resolved and the widow cared for, arranged the marriage without consulting either party beyond a brief, awkward meeting where Nathaniel and Abigail exchanged nothing more than uncomfortable nods. On the day of the wedding, Abigail stood at the small church altar in a simple, black mourning dress she hadn't yet had reason to retire, her eyes red-rimmed but composed, while Nathaniel arrived in his only decent shirt, looking as though he'd rather face a stampede than the vows awaiting him. Neither spoke during the brief ceremony beyond the required words, both keenly aware that this union was born not of choice, but of obligation to a debt and a community that expected them to simply make the best of an impossible situation. The ride to Abigail's homestead was tense and silent, broken only by the soft murmurs of her two children, a boy and girl no older than 6 and 8, peering curiously at the stranger now bound to their mother. Nathaniel kept his eyes fixed on the road, uncertain how to navigate a life suddenly filled with a widow's grief, to grieving children, and expectations he'd never asked to carry. When they arrived, Abigail showed him to a small room adjoining the main house, her voice quiet and formal, careful to maintain distance between them despite the vows, now binding their lives together. The following weeks settled into an uneasy rhythm. Nathaniel threw himself into repairing the neglected homestead, mending fences, tending livestock, fixing the roof before winter's chill deepened, while Abigail managed the household and her children with quiet determination, the two of them orbiting each other's lives without truly touching. Yet Nathaniel found himself increasingly aware of small moments, the exhausted tenderness in Abigail's eyes as she tucked her children into bed each night, the quiet strength she carried despite her grief, the way she never once complained, despite the enormous weight she'd been forced to bear alone. One evening, as an early frost threatened the fields, Nathaniel found Abigail alone by the barn, silently weeping over a photograph of her late husband, the weight of her loss finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. He hesitated, uncertain whether to intrude on her grief, but something in her fragile posture drew him closer despite himself. Without a word, he sat beside her, offering only his quiet presence. No demands, no expectations, simply company in her sorrow. "I never wanted any of this," Abigail admitted softly, wiping her eyes. "Not his death, not this marriage, not any of it." "Neither did I," Nathaniel replied, his voice unusually gentle. "But I'm not sorry to be here, if that means anything." Abigail looked up at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his weathered features, and for the first time since the wedding, something like understanding passed quietly between them, a fragile beginning neither had expected, born not from romance, but from shared burden and unexpected compassion. Walls slowly falling. As autumn deepened into winter, Nathaniel found himself settling into a life he'd never anticipated wanting. The children, once wary of the quiet stranger their mother had married, began warming to him, the boy following him eagerly during chores, peppering him with questions about cattle and horses, while the girl grew bold enough to request bedtime stories from him on evenings when Abigail was too exhausted to provide them herself. Nathaniel, who had spent his entire life avoiding the vulnerability of caring for others, found himself surprised by how naturally these small responsibilities began to feel. Abigail, too, noticed the shift, watching with cautious hope as the solitary cowboy she'd been forced to marry slowly transformed into someone her children trusted, someone whose quiet presence had become a steady comfort rather than an unwelcome obligation. She found herself increasingly grateful not merely for the practical support he provided, but for the gentle patience with which he navigated her family's grief, never pushing, never demanding gratitude, simply present when needed and invisible when space was required. Yet despite the growing warmth between them, both Nathaniel and Abigail maintained careful emotional distance. Wary of complicating an arrangement, neither had chosen with feelings. Neither felt entitled to claim. Abigail still wore her husband's memory close to her heart, uncertain whether allowing herself to care for Nathaniel would betray the grief she still carried. Nathaniel, meanwhile, remained haunted by a lifetime of learned self-reliance, uncertain whether he deserved the fragile family slowly forming around him, or whether he might eventually disappoint them, as he feared he inevitably disappointed everyone who dared depend on him. The turning point came during a fierce winter storm that threatened to collapse the barn roof, endangering the livestock that represented the family's entire livelihood. Nathaniel worked through the night in brutal cold, refusing to abandon the effort despite the danger, driven by a fierce determination to protect the family that had unexpectedly become his own. When Abigail found him near dawn, exhausted and frostbitten but successful, something in her carefully maintained composure finally broke. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. "You could have let it fall. No one would have blamed you." "I couldn't," Nathaniel replied simply, too tired for pretense. "Not when it means everything to you and the children." Abigail stared at him, snow still clinging to his eyelashes, exhaustion evident in every line of his face, and realized with startling clarity that this man, forced into her life by nothing more than an old debt, had become someone she genuinely cared for, not as an obligation, but as a partner she hadn't known she needed. Nathaniel, meeting her gaze in the pale winter light, felt something shift within himself as well. A wall he'd maintained his entire life, finally beginning to crumble beneath the weight of genuine connection neither of them had anticipated finding within a marriage built on debt rather than desire. The first kiss. Spring arrived slowly, thawing the frozen fields and softening the guarded distance that had defined Nathaniel and Abigail's marriage. Since its reluctant beginning, the homestead flourished under their combined effort, the children thriving in the stability their unconventional family had somehow managed to build, while Nathaniel and Abigail found themselves sharing quiet evenings by the fire, conversations lasting long after the children had gone to bed, a friendship deepening into something neither had explicitly named but both had begun to feel. Yet a shadow remained over their fragile happiness. Abigail's late husband's former deputy, a bitter man named Frank Das, who had long harbored resentment toward the Reyes family and grew increasingly hostile as he watched Nathaniel step into a role he believed should have been his own. Das began spreading rumors throughout town, suggesting Nathaniel had married Abigail purely for her late husband's land, questioning his intentions and stirring doubt among neighbors who had initially supported the arranged union. The whispers reached Abigail, planting seeds of uncertainty. Despite the trust she'd slowly built with Nathaniel, confronted with Doss's accusations one evening in town, Abigail found herself defending Nathaniel with a fierce conviction that surprised even herself, insisting to skeptical neighbors that his devotion to her family had nothing to do with land or debt, but with genuine care that had grown organically between them. When she returned home and relayed the confrontation to Nathaniel, expecting perhaps gratitude or relief, she instead found him unusually quiet, wrestling with emotions he'd spent a lifetime suppressing. "Why does it matter so much to you what they think?" she finally asked, searching his troubled expression. "Because I don't want you to doubt me," Nathaniel admitted, his voice raw with a vulnerability he'd never allowed himself before. "Not when everything I feel for you and the children has become the realest thing in my life." Abigail's breath caught at his admission, the walls she'd maintained since her husband's death finally giving way to the feelings she'd been quietly nursing for months. She stepped closer, closing the distance that had defined their relationship since its reluctant beginning, and Nathaniel, sensing the shift, reached for her with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. Their first kiss was hesitant at first, uncertain, to wounded hearts finally allowing themselves the vulnerability of genuine connection, before deepening into something both had unknowingly craved since the day fate had forced them together. In the weeks that followed, Doss's accusations lost their power entirely. unable to withstand the obvious devotion, now openly shared between Nathaniel and Abigail. Their bond finally acknowledged before the entire community that had once forced them into an unwanted union. The children, sensing the shift in their parents' relationship, embraced Nathaniel fully as the father figure he'd quietly become, completing a family neither Nathaniel nor Abigail had believed themselves capable of building. Standing together on the homestead they had rebuilt through hardship, loss, and unexpected love, Nathaniel finally understood that the debt which had once bound him to Abigail against his will had ultimately given him something he'd spent his entire life avoiding: a family, a home, and a love deep enough to heal even the loneliest of hearts. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful love stories filled with second chances, healing, and unforgettable romance. New episodes are coming soon, and you won't want to miss what happens next.